January 17, 1945, 30,000 feet above the Sea of Japan. The air is thin here, so thin that a man without oxygen would lose consciousness in minutes. The temperature sits at 40 degrees below zero. Ice crystals form on metal surfaces, glittering in the pale winter sun that bleeds through the cockpit glass. At this altitude, the world below becomes abstract, a watercolor of greys and whites, where the islands of Japan appear as brushstrokes on parchment, distant and untouchable. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai banks his Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter into a climbing turn, engines screaming at full throttle. His altimeter needle trembles past 28,000 feet. His oxygen mask hisses with each breath. Through the frosted edge of his canopy he sees them, massive silver shapes moving through the stratosphere like whales through deep ocean, their contrails writing lines of chalk across the blue-black void of the upper atmosphere. He counts 12, then 20, then loses count. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers cruised in formation at 30,000 feet, untouchable as gods. Sakai pushes his throttle forward, demanding everything from an engine designed for lower altitudes, for carrier decks and dogfights over coral atolls. The Zero shudders. The engine coughs. At 29,000 feet, his fighter begins to stall, the controls going mushy in his hands. The B-29s continue onward, steady and serene, another 1,000 feet above him. He cannot reach them. He cannot reach them. He falls away, spiraling back toward breathable air, toward the reality that has been slowly, methodically revealing itself to every Japanese pilot in the Pacific. The war they thought they were fighting no longer exists. This is not the war they were promised. 4 years earlier, in December 1941, Japanese naval aviators had ruled the Pacific sky with absolute authority. Their Zeros were technological marvels, lightweight, agile, capable of outmaneuvering every American fighter they encountered. At Pearl Harbor, at Wake Island, over the Philippines and Singapore, Japanese pilots had cut through enemy formations like samurai through silk. The Zero could climb faster, turn tighter, and fly farther than any opposing aircraft. American pilots who survived those early encounters returned with stories that bordered on disbelief. Enemy fighters that seemed to defy physics, flown by men who seemed to defy death itself. The Japanese military had built its aviation doctrine on the philosophy of seishin spirit, willpower, the belief that superior morale and warrior dedication could overcome material disadvantage. Pilots trained until their bodies became extensions of their aircraft. They flew without parachutes, not because they lacked them, but because bailing out was considered cowardice. They embraced junkusai, the shattering of the jewel, the idea that honorable death in combat was preferable to survival in defeat. This was not bravado, this was religious conviction. And for 2 years it worked. The Japanese Empire expanded across the Pacific like a flood, swallowing islands, colonies, and territories with terrifying speed. By mid-1942, Japan controlled an area stretching from Burma to the Gilbert Islands, from the Aleutians to the edge of Australia. The Zero symbol, painted on their aircraft fuselages, became a mark of invincibility. Then came Midway. Then came Guadalcanal. Then came the slow, grinding realization that America was not fighting the war Japan expected. The B-29 Superfortress was not merely an aeroplane, it was a statement of industrial philosophy, a manifestation of American abundance rendered in aluminium and plexiglass. Where Japanese engineers had created the Zero by removing everything unnecessary, armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, heavy armament, American engineers had created the B-29 by adding everything possible. It was the most expensive weapons system of World War II, costing more than the Manhattan Project that would later produce the atomic bomb. Each aircraft required 600,000 rivets. Each one took 200,000 man-hours to build. The United States produced 3,970 of them. The B-29 weighed 120,000 pounds, fully loaded, 4 times the weight of a Zero. It carried 5 tons of bombs across 3,250 miles. Its 4 Wright-Ra 3350 radial engines each produced 2,200 horsepower, turning massive propellers that pulled the air so thin that Japanese fighters struggled to even reach it. The bomber's service ceiling of 31,850 feet placed it in a realm where conventional interceptors suffocated. But altitude was only part of the equation. The B-29 was pressurized, meaning its crew could operate in shirt sleeves while enemy pilots clawed for oxygen in freezing cockpits. It was defended by 12.50 caliber machine guns and a 20 mm cannon, all linked to a computerized fire control system that calculated lead, deflection, and range automatically. Its central fire control system allowed gunners to aim remotely, tracking attackers with analog computers that processed data faster than human reflexes. When Japanese pilots closed to attack range, they entered a sphere of intersecting fire lanes, where death came from multiple directions simultaneously. The Japanese had never seen anything like it. They had no aircraft that could match it, no industrial capacity to build one if they tried, and no tactical doctrine to counter it. The B-29 rendered obsolete every assumption that Japanese military planners had made about strategic bombing, about defensive capabilities, about what was possible. November 24, 1944, Tokyo. The first B-29 raid on the Japanese mainland arrives in daylight. 111 bombers approach from the east, their aluminium skins flashing in the autumn sun. Air raid sirens wail across the capital. Citizens who have been told for 4 years that their military is invincible look up and see the enemy flying overhead in perfect formation, unchallenged, dropping bombs with methodical precision on the Nakajima aircraft factory. Lieutenant Isamu Sasaki scrambles his Zero from Chofu airfield. He has 23 kills to his name, most from the early war when targets were plentiful and victories came easily. He climbs toward the bomber stream, watching his altimeter spiral upward. At 20,000 feet, his Zero is sluggish but manageable. At 25,000 feet, the controls feel like they're moving through syrup. At 28,000 feet, he is at his absolute ceiling. Engine gasping, airspeed bleeding away. The B-29s cruise 2,000 feet above him, serene and untouchable. He tries anyway. He noses up, trading speed for altitude, coaxing his fighter into a near stall. For a moment, he is level with the bomber formation. He sees the sun glinting off their plexiglass nose turrets. He sees their bomb bay doors opening like the bellies of mechanical leviathans. He squeezes his trigger. His 20 ME cannon shells arc upward, falling short by hundreds of feet, their trajectories bending downward in the thin air before reaching the targets. Then the return fire comes. Tracer rounds from multiple B-29s converge on his position, .50 caliber bullets moving so fast they appear as solid lines of light. One round punches through his canopy. Another tears through his left wing, ripping away fabric and framework. His engine begins to smoke. He rolls away, diving back toward thicker air, back toward the possibility of survival. Behind him, the B-29s continue their bombing run. Undisturbed, the factory below erupts in orange flame and black smoke. Sasaki lands at Chofu with his aircraft shot to pieces. Ground crew counts 14 bullet holes. He climbs out of his cockpit and vomits on the tarmac, not from injury, but from the realization settling into his bones. They cannot stop these aircraft. Not with courage, not with skill, not with spirit. The panic that spread through Japanese fighter squadrons in late 1944 was not the panic of cowardice. It was the panic of obsolescence, of men trained for one kind of warfare, suddenly confronting another. Japanese pilots were exceptional, their training was brutal and thorough, their tactical skills honed by years of combat experience, but they were flying aircraft designed in 1937 to fight a war that no longer existed. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had been built for carrier operations against opponents with similar technological capabilities. It was a masterpiece of lightweight engineering, a fighter that could fly 1,900 miles and dogfight with balletic grace, but it had no supercharger capable of maintaining engine performance above 20,000 feet. Its wing loading, the ratio of weight to wing area, made it nimble at low altitude but ungainly in the thin air of the stratosphere. Its armament, effective against the fabric and wood aircraft of China and the early Pacific War, was inadequate against bombers armored with quarter-inch steel plate. Japanese engineers knew this. By 1944, they had developed high-altitude interceptors, the Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden, the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, the Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien. These aircraft could reach 30,000 feet, some could even exceed it. But they arrived too late and in numbers too small. American submarines and bombing raids had shattered Japan's industrial capacity. Factories that should have been producing interceptors were producing spare parts for damaged aircraft. Factories that should have been producing engines were producing training gliders. The mathematics of attrition had become inescapable. For every new fighter Japan built, America built 20. For every trained pilot Japan lost, America trained 100. By early 1945, many Japanese fighter squadrons were flying aircraft with engines that had exceeded their operational lifespan, burning fuel contaminated with pine root oil because petroleum reserves had been exhausted. Flown by pilots with fewer than 100 hours of training because veteran instructors were dead, they climbed toward B-29 formations, knowing they might not reach them, knowing that even if they did, their ammunition might not penetrate, knowing that the computerized gun turrets would track them with inhuman precision. They climbed anyway, because orders were orders, because Seishin demanded it, because admitting the impossibility of the task was admitting the impossibility of victory. March 9, 1945, Tokyo, night. The B-29s come again, but this time they are different. They arrive after midnight, flying low, between 5,000 and 9,000 feet. Altitudes where Japanese fighters can reach them, where anti-aircraft guns can find them. For a moment, the defenders feel something like hope. Finally, an engagement they can fight. Then the incendiaries begin to fall. The bombers carry no high explosives this night. Their bomb bays are packed with M69 incendiary clusters, each one containing 48 hexagonal tubes filled with napalm, jellied gasoline that sticks to surfaces and burns at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The B-29s drop their loads in a cross pattern, creating a perimeter of fire that ignites the wooden structures of Tokyo's eastern district. Wind feeds the flames. The flames create their own wind. Within 30 minutes, a firestorm develops, a self-sustaining inferno that generates hurricane-force updrafts, sucking oxygen from the air, pulling people into the flames like a living thing. Japanese fighters climb into smoke so thick it chokes their engines. They fire at B-29s, illuminated by the glow of the burning city below, but the bombers keep coming in waves. 334 aircraft dropping 1,665 tons of incendiaries over 3 hours. The heat is so intense that B-29 crews at 6,000 feet report turbulence from thermal columns. Pilots wear oxygen masks not because of altitude but because of smoke. Some bombers return to base with the smell of burned human flesh embedded in their unpressurized wheel wells. By dawn, 16 square miles of Tokyo have ceased to exist. 83,000 people are dead. 1 million are homeless. The firestorm has created temperatures hot enough to melt glass, to boil the water in canals, to consume fire trucks and stone buildings and anything else that stood in its path. Japanese pilots who survived the night land at airfields surrounded by ash. They climb out of cockpits and look east, toward where neighborhoods used to be, and see only smoke rising into the morning sky, like the ghosts of the dead ascending. They shot down 14 B-29s that night, less than 5% of the attacking force. The Americans considered it an acceptable loss rate. They would return in 2 days to bomb Nagoya, then Osaka, then Kobe, then Tokyo again. The panic intensifies, not the fear of death. Japanese pilots had made peace with death long ago. The panic of irrelevance, of fighting an enemy that operates by rules you cannot comprehend, with resources you cannot match, toward objectives that make your destruction mathematically inevitable. The recurring symbol of American abundance was not a weapon. It was something simpler, more mundane, more psychologically devastating: the existence of choice. Japanese pilots who shot down B-29s and survived to examine the wreckage or who interrogated captured American aircrews, encountered evidence of an industrial reality that bordered on the incomprehensible. The bombers carried emergency rations that included chocolate bars, cigarettes, and coffee, not as luxuries, but as standard equipment. The crews wore electrically heated flight suits. They had walkie-talkie radios for communication after bailout. They carried life rafts with fishing kits and desalination tablets and shark repellent. One captured B-29 crewman's survival vest contained the following items: a .45 caliber pistol with spare magazines, a machete, a first aid kit with morphine syrettes, water purification tablets, a signal mirror, a compass, matches in a waterproof case, a fishing kit, a multi-tool knife, bouillon cubes, and a silk map of the Pacific. The combined weight of these items exceeded the personal equipment allowance of an entire Japanese fighter squadron. But the most psychologically disorienting discovery was food. American air crews flew combat missions with sandwiches. Real sandwiches, bread, meat, cheese, prepared fresh before takeoff because B-29 bases had bakeries and refrigeration. They had coffee. They had orange juice from concentrate, a technology Japan had never developed. They threw away half-eaten meals because they knew more meals were coming. By 1945, Japanese pilots were flying combat missions after eating a ball of rice and, if they were lucky, a piece of pickled radish. Their rations had been cut 3 times. Many suffered from malnutrition illnesses, beriberi, night blindness, chronic fatigue. American prisoners of war were starving, not because of deliberate cruelty, but because their captors were starving too. The Japanese home islands were under blockade, food imports had stopped, the military requisitioned everything, and there was never enough. A Japanese pilot named Yasuhiko Kuro, who survived the war and wrote his memoirs in the 1970s, described the moment he understood Japan had lost. It was not during combat. It was after his squadron shot down a B-29 and he examined the wreckage. He found, in the debris of the radio operator's station, an unopened Hershey's chocolate bar. He took it. He ate it slowly, rationing it over 3 days. It was the best food he had tasted in a year. I realized, he wrote, that we were fighting a country that could afford to give its soldiers candy. We were fighting a country that mass-produced luxury. Our leaders had told us that Americans were soft, that they lacked warrior spirit, that their materialism made them weak. But that chocolate bar told a different story. It told me that America could feed its soldiers better than we could feed our civilians. It told me that their abundance was not weakness. It was a weapon we had no defense against. The transformation in Japanese fighter tactics reflected the transformation in Japanese strategic reality. By mid-1945, conventional interception had become suicide with extra steps. Squadrons adopted increasingly desperate methods. Some pilots attempted to ram B-29s, turning their Zeros into manned missiles. Others tried night interceptions without radar, relying on moonlight and intuition. A few units experimented with air-to-air bombing, trying to drop phosphorus bombs on bomber formations from above, a tactic that never succeeded but consumed resources and lives in the attempt. Then came the kamikaze. The special attack units, Tokubetsu Kogu Keitai, shortened to Tokotai, emerged not from fanaticism but from mathematics. Japanese commanders calculated that a pilot with 50 hours of training had a 5% chance of hitting a moving ship with bombs or torpedoes, but a pilot who crashed his aircraft directly into the ship, who turned himself into a guided missile, had a 25% chance of hitting. The math was simple. The cost was absolute. Against B-29s at 30,000 feet, even kamikaze attacks failed. The bombers were too high, too fast, and too well defended. The special attack units focused on naval targets instead, on aircraft carriers and destroyers and troop transports, where flight deck crews and sailors became targets of men who had chosen death over the alternative of continued existence in a losing war. But the panic remained. It spread through air bases and command centers, through pilot-ready rooms and maintenance hangars. It was the panic of intelligent men realizing that courage and sacrifice had become tactically irrelevant. that their enemy had industrialized warfare to a degree their empire could never match, that every resource Japan concentrated on defense, every fighter, every pilot, every gallon of fuel, was a resource not being used elsewhere, and there were no resources left to spare. August 6, 1945, 31,000 feet above Hiroshima. A single B-29 named Enola Gay cruises through clear morning sky. No fighter escorts, no fighter opposition. Japanese radar tracks it, but one bomber is not considered a significant threat. Air raid sirens sound briefly, then fall silent. The bomber is alone. At 8:15, IM Bombardier Major Thomas Ferriby releases a single weapon from the bomb bay. It falls for 43 seconds. Then the sky tears open. The atomic bomb. Code name Little Boy. A uranium-235 fission device with a yield equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. Detonates 1,900 feet above the city center. The fireball reaches temperatures of several million degrees. The blast wave travels faster than sound. Thermal radiation ignites everything combustible within a mile and a half. 66,000 people die instantly. Another 70,000 will die from radiation poisoning, burns and injuries over the following months. The mushroom cloud rises to 40,000 feet. B-29 crews 50 miles away see it. They see the flash. They feel the shockwave rattle their aircraft. They smell something acrid and chemical in the air, even through their oxygen masks. Japanese fighter pilots at Matsuyama Air Base, 120 miles away, see the flash on the horizon. They receive no orders to scramble. There is nothing to intercept. The bomber is already gone. 3 days later, another B-29 Boxer drops a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. 70,000 more dead. The Japanese government surrenders on August 15. The war ends not because Japanese forces are defeated in the field. There are still 2 million soldiers under arms, still thousands of aircraft prepared for homeland defense, but because the alternative is annihilation. The B-29s have demonstrated that America can destroy Japanese cities at will, from altitudes Japanese fighters cannot reach, with weapons Japanese science cannot match. The panic that began in January 1945, when pilots first tried to intercept bombers at 30,000 feet, has become existential reality. The epilogue of this story is not written in victory or defeat. It is written in the memoirs of men who survived, in the silence of men who did not, in the realization that technological abundance had become a form of warfare more decisive than any battlefield courage. Saburo Sakai, the pilot who could not reach the B-29s in January 1945, survived the war. He became a businessman, a writer, and eventually a friend to American pilots he once fought. In his autobiography, published in 1957, he wrote, "We were brave men, we were skilled pilots, we were willing to die. But none of that mattered. The Americans had built a machine that made bravery irrelevant. They had industrialized death, and we had nothing to counter it, except our lives. We gave our lives freely. It changed nothing." The B-29 Superfortress was not merely an aircraft, it was proof of concept. Proof that a democratic society with industrial abundance could wage total war more effectively than a militaristic society built on scarcity and sacrifice. The Japanese warrior code emphasized spirit over material, willpower over resources, death over surrender. The B-29 rendered that philosophy obsolete. It demonstrated that in modern warfare, production capacity matters more than warrior spirit, that logistics defeats courage, that the nation which can build 4,000 heavy bombers while simultaneously building 100,000 fighters and 100 aircraft carriers has already won, regardless of how bravely its enemies fight. The panic Japanese pilots felt at 30,000 feet was not the fear of death. It was the fear of irrelevance, the realization that they were fighting an enemy that operated by fundamentally different rules. Rules written in steel and aluminium, and high-octane gasoline and chocolate bars, and pressurized cabins and computerized gun sights. Rules that said abundance was strength, that material advantage was moral advantage, that the ability to mass-produce victory was itself a form of superiority. They climbed into thin air where their engines choked and their controls froze and their ammunition fell short. They climbed knowing they could not win, could not even fight effectively, but climbed anyway, because the alternative was admitting that everything they had been told about spirit and willpower and the warrior code was a beautiful lie that shattered against the reality of industrial warfare. Above them, untouchable as clouds, the B-29s flew on, silver shapes in the stratosphere, carrying bombs or incendiaries or atomic fire, flown by men who ate sandwiches and drank coffee and went home after their missions to write letters about how the war would be over soon. The contrails they left behind wrote the ending of an empire across the sky, one white line at a time, in air too thin for warriors to breathe.